The hardest part of discussing Shin Kamen Rider is knowing where to start. Because it's this crossing of several mediums I adore, but are mostly separate, and finding a way to transition from one to the next without dragging it out has been difficult. Over the past few years, I have developed an obsession with the Kamen Rider series, this semi-obscure superhero show that has held Japan's action scene in a vice grip for the better part of 20 years. And it's a fervent love that's only deepened the more of it I'm exposed to. So in 2020, when the series had announced a new film from director Hideaki Anno, who has created some works I would describe as foundational to my view of art, it felt like it was being made almost exclusively for me. Before I ever saw Shin Kamen Rider, I knew I'd have to talk about this once-in-a-lifetime meet because of how deeply it affected my expectations and view of the work. But having seen it for myself, I feel a lot more confident in that resolution, because if you don't share my experience with the director's output, and with Kamen Rider in general, parts of Shin will be borderline incomprehensible. So let's begin with Anno, whose career in the anime industry can be traced back to the founding of Studio Ghibli and a sort of pseudo-mentorship with its founder, Hayao Miyazaki, but whose status as a legend was cemented with Neon Genesis Evangelion. The kind of work that fosters a lifelong love in its viewership, and 20 years on, still coaxes new viewer. There's at least one person you know who cloaks themselves in the imagery and stylings of the series. I can't quite claim fandom to that degree, but I can say I routinely, on an ever-shrinking time scale, return to the series and discover something new from it. The fact that has gone on to be foundational to my views on art, as something that by necessity requires multiple views to ever truly understand. Yet beyond this, his 2016 live-action outing, Shin Godzilla, is maybe more important to the immediate discussion. It was a fairly surprise announcement. Shin Goji was not Anno's first live-action feature, but it was maybe his most high-profile one. It placed him in a more mainstream view in the West, where the anime industry has a somewhat insulated reputation. Godzilla was more than just a series for the Japan-obsessed. It had long since woven its way into the fabric of cinema at large and been a keen influence on some of the greatest directors of the 70s and beyond, during which the character had a brief respite before returning with renewed vigor. Shin Godzilla has been the first Japanese-produced film in the franchise in over a decade, and seemed to be created in direct response to the 2014 American film from Legendary Pictures. And the two projects reinvigorated the brand. Shin Godzilla took a very different approach to the subject matter than Legendary did, opting for a kind of death by a thousand cuts narrative. Instead of a single hero who bumbles his way into Big G's path, the film mostly followed an expansive cast of bureaucrats who must solve the problem of Godzilla, and maybe the most grounded and realistic approach to a giant monster movie ever put to film. A style that has cemented it in my mind as an all-time great disaster film, even if I find its approach to Godzilla himself kind of middling. Anno followed this up with Shin Ultraman, a modern retelling of the vintage superhero series of the same name. Following a member of the Science Patrol who is possessed by an alien spirit, the titular Ultraman assists the people of Earth in stopping tragedies both from space and from the planet's ever-destabilized ecosystem. Anno's approach here was extremely similar to Shin Goji, opting for a less sci-fi and more modern office look to the Science Patrol, and favoring a large group dynamic over a smaller, more intimate cast. An approach true to the series itself, where the titular Ultraman plays a borderline faceless grunt whose role is sometimes non-existent outside of the climactic fights. Nevertheless, this was the first time I began to become skeptical of the then unreleased Kamen Rider entry. Godzilla and Ultraman both favored the peanut gallery approach, but Kamen Rider did not. It was a far more character-driven work, where the lead hero's strive and angst is core to the drama that etched the series into the Japanese zeitgeist half a century later. Kamen Rider's origins came when Toei, a TV studio in Japan that today produces anime staples like One Piece and Dragon Ball, approached comic author Shotaro Ishinomori about a Saturday morning superhero show. Ishinomori's first draft featured a vampire vigilante and his shape-shifting servant uncovering a hidden conspiracy against their kind. It was a premise with potential, but supposedly Toei found it too dark for a family show. Reworking the show, Shotaro drew heavy influence from Western comics, giving the hero a bug motif and a more altruistic motivation. In this iteration, genius athlete Takeshi Hongo is abducted by the neo-fascist group Shocker and transformed into a monstrous cyborg, but a repentant scientist frees Hongo before the procedure is complete and frees him from his imprisonment. Now loose and targeted by the group, Hongo fights a war in the shadows for the soul of Japan and the freedom of the world at large. Unlike Ultraman, who mostly played a background role in his series, Hongo was central to the narrative of Kamen Rider, often finding himself alienated from his peers by his superhuman strength, and the fact anyone aware of Shocker's poisonous plots became a target by the organization. And the series was not shy about showing the grisly consequences. It was ahead of its time in the early 70s, and while its cheap effects can be a hindrance at times, at others, it's endearing to see how creative the crew of the series got with their limited means. Kamen Rider throws a Shocker soldier through a window, and a cutaway to a red splat on the ground is all the viewer needs to understand how grisly the act is. In my mind, the true Kamen Rider calls to mind the iconography of the desperado, a man on the edge of civilization waging a war with a loose sense of justice and a lot of piss and vinegar. His ruby red scarf calls to mind the bright yellow pipe Lee Van Cleef perpetually smoked and for a few dollars more. The rider is wreathed in solitude. Knowing to implicate others is to condemn them, and the obscene strength that prevents him from relating to others is the only tool that can ever bring them peace. In truth, this is not and has never really been the case. Calling back to its influences from Western comics, the average episode of Kamen Rider sees Hongo living a somewhat normal life only to stumble into the plots of Shocker and foil them out of innate altruism. His distance from those he saves more of a tragic underline. It feels like I'm spending a lot of time in the preamble. I assure you it's not a sin or a courtesy the film itself suffers. Shin Rider opens with Hongo having already escaped the confines of Shocker and fighting purely on instinct. We see nothing of Hongo's time pre-Rider or his day-to-day life, and we only get a courtesy assessment in a conversation after the opening fight. It's a jarring decision to start the story, as while foregoing the origin isn't uncommon for superhero stories today, it's so early in the story of Takeshi that it feels like a scene was clipped from the film's opening by accident. It's a bit like starting a Spider-Man film immediately after the death of Uncle Ben, but before he gets his proper costume. It's at this point that the cultural disparity between Japan and America starts to become more apparent. After the movie, I struck up a conversation with another moviegoer who was less familiar with the franchise and came to see it with a friend on the weight of Anno's name alone. He said the movie was a big step down from Shin Ultraman, a movie he loved despite not being familiar with that source material either, and I can't really fault him or anyone else for feeling that way. Shin Ultra plays like a mystery, building up the apparent connection between the title hero and the protagonist from afar, allowing us to ponder and piece it together over the course of the film. It's a decision that allows those unfamiliar with the source material to engage with an otherwise directionless plot, and it allows the more hardcore fans to see Ultraman from the perspective of his cohorts. In contrast, Shin Kamen Rider expects a much deeper familiarity with the source subject. Nowhere is this more apparent than the inclusion of the second Kamen Rider, whose story in the Toku community is so ubiquitous it's become mythic. As the story goes, the actor for the original Takeshi Hongo, Hiroshi Fujioka, did the stunt work for the show as well and wiped out on set, cracking his leg in several places. Rather than cancel the show or recast him, the crew decided to introduce a second Kamen Rider, Hayato Ichimonji, explaining the original was fighting the evil Shocker across the sea in America. The second rider took on a spunkier, more Peter Parker approach to his life as a writer and kept the show going for over a year before Hongo's return. Anyone familiar with the greater Kamen Rider mythos knows this story and the fact that there were two original writers. To adapt the original series without Hayato isn't just unexpected, it's borderline sacrilege. This means, to the average Japanese viewer, seeing Hayato unceremoniously appear from the background is an understated way to introduce an icon, not dissimilar to Tobey Maguire's average Joe look in the Spider-Man movie. To the uninitiated, it raises a lot of questions. Why are there two Hopper men? Who is he? Where is he from? What's the point of introducing him so late? At times like these, a new inductee may take refuge in their own ignorance. Anything unseemly or unfamiliar is explained away by being taken from a full series where the ideas have more time to grow and breathe. But this is an envious position to take, as the more formally familiar will be just as jarred. What's the habitat zone? What's prana? What does Ruriko do with it? What is this iteration of Shocker? Some of these questions are answered fully, and some can be deduced, but some are hidden not in the original writer, but in Anno's other works. The description of the habitat zone, a nebulous space where there are no boundaries between body and soul, is strikingly similar to that of instrumentality from Evangelion, a concept that even diehards of that series sometimes misunderstand. This feels like part of a bigger trend with the series I've noticed. Typically, a Kamen Rider series runs from 45 to 50 episodes over the course of a year and follows a set of milestones along the way. This is the format the series has held for over 20 years now, and much like every comic book fan has a Doctor Doom story in their back pocket, every Kamen Rider fan has their Kamen Rider story, a season-long affair they dream of. Last year saw the release of Kamen Rider Black Sun, a more mature take on a classic Rider story that I enjoyed despite having some major flaws with it. At the time, I had an inkling that Black Sun was not intended as a remake of an existing series, but as the creator's back pocket writer adapted to the format, as the likelihood of a second shot is ever decreasing. This created a series that felt at odds with itself, at times homaging the original in between scenes that felt disconnected from the story and style. The tribute was genuine and heartfelt, but it felt like a half measure between an original story and a love letter. It's an issue I feel is true in Shin as well, where in a full series the mechanics of Prana and Shocker could be fully explored without resorting to a full-on exposition dump, something Anno seems to despise. But Kamen Rider is not about its big concepts nearly as much as its characters. My fear that the film would be too distant from the internal drama that defined the original was, frankly, foolish. Anno's masterwork Evangelion was defined entirely by its intense internal drama between the characters and their own internal worlds. And while the other Shin series may have reduced that, Kamen Rider does not. In the original series, an early scene sees Hongo turning a spigot, only for the nozzle to snap off entirely. It's a seminal moment for the character and one that defines the original series in my mind. In Shin, Anno opts for a more direct approach. A transformed Hongo with bated breath peels off his glove and discovers under his suit he's become something horrid and ugly, and begins to claw at his helmet, needing to see just what he's fully become. It's a palpable moment, one I can feel will influence the series for years to come. The core of Shin Rider's story follows Hongo as he is recruited by Professor Midorikawa in his war against Shocker, primarily acting as the bodyguard of his daughter Ruriko, who has a unique ability to synthesize prana, a sort of effluviant energy that powers the Shocker machines. Unlike Hongo, who was abducted as an adult, Ruriko has been living and working under Shocker for years, potentially since she was a child. To her, the fight against Shocker is all-encompassing and her sole purpose, which gives her an indignant view of Hongo and his fresh trauma. It's this discrepancy that plays at the heart of the story, with Ruriko and Hongo's distance closing as they survive the trials of Shocker. It's a strong echo of Anno's Evangelion, compounded by the official art depicting the Eva cast as their Shin counterparts. It's hard not to see Hongo and Ruriko as more mature but more callous forms of the heroes Shinji and Rei that precede them. It's hard to remember the last time I saw a superhero movie show anything as intimate as this relationship, but Shin manages to outdo most cape flicks in another key capacity: action. In the pre-release impressions of Shin Rider, a common critique was the effects being subpar, something I sort of expected from the get-go. Kamen Rider, despite being very special effects heavy, has never really been on the cutting edge of effects work, and expecting Avengers level effects would have been unrealistic. Which makes it all the more surprising that I honestly think Shin Rider surpasses most MCU films in CG quality. A particular fight set in an old industrial sector comes to mind, as we see the suits in direct, clear detail before their fight begins, only for the suits to remain identical after the fight starts and the two begin leaping across smokestacks. It's hard to note just how impressive it is without seeing it directly, but you can see the way the light catches on the real-life helmet and see the same visual in the CG model. Having seen my fair share of superhero films, the glossy, clean CG that covers the industry has become a hallmark of a half-assed work to me. So seeing the soft, fuzzy, reflected sunlight on Ryder's matte-finished mask, even when he's suspended in the air, is a refreshing sight. It's become clear to me a lot of the early assessment of poor effects was a deliberate choice on Anno's part. Rather than mimicking reality at all costs, Shin Rider dips into more absurd territory, at times closing in on the intense style of Chinese wushu. I might be saying that wrong. It feels clear that Anno chose this style to emphasize the power of these shocker augments, to great effect. In one pivotal scene, Rider fights an augment with super speed and adjusts his own output to match. For the past decade, super speed feels as if it's only represented in elongated slow-mo, but Shin opts for the opposite. Rather than slowing down, the film mimics the jittery, undercranked look of classic films, creating a stop-motion look when Rider is in super mode. It's a simple, familiar effect, but one that works so well, I have to wonder why no one at the WB billion-dollar DC machine thought to use it for the Flash. Of course, a major part of this is how phenomenal the designs in Shin Rider just are. Perhaps no art form is as reliant on fantastic design work than that of the superhero, whose success often lives and dies by their suit design. Much has been said about the modern film trend of adding unnecessary lines and segmentation to classic suits in the name of complexity, but perhaps no greater refutation can be found than in Shin Kamen Rider's titular suit, which not only mimics the flaws of the original, it enhances them. While additional detail can be found with screws and paneling, the overall design remains identical to the 70s original, with only the materials being updated and the colors altered. The light pink on canvas green helmet is a design choice that, frankly, shouldn't work, but is incredible. In my mind, the suit gives an almost bruised look, like bolted on steel metal, and the trauma of the procedure has drained the life from Rider's eyes. It calls to mind parasites that take over and mimic the behavior of their host insects. It's a perfect metaphor for Hongo's lost humanity. The cherry on top is the fluff of hair that hangs out the back, a decision I initially found to be too much, but have since realized it fills out the profile perfectly. Hayato's higher contrast helmet and racing stripe is a strong alternate finish, but I can't bring myself to imagine Kamen Rider as anything other than Shin Hongo, and I don't foresee it changing anytime soon. With such fantastic design and action work, it would be nice to say the flaws of Shin Rider don't inhibit my enjoyment too much, but a much bigger issue rears its head in the last act. Despite having good ideas on paper, the last two fights both make decisions that make actually enjoying them extremely difficult. The first, a high-octane race against Shocker, is filmed in near pitch black that makes the fight impossible to see. The second, a beleaguered fist fight, feels more like an amateur wrestling match. They're ideas that should work, but are directed in a way that undermines them and the tension they should be building to. Were they earlier in the film, I'd have an easier time forgiving it, but as the climax, it left me feeling unfulfilled. As someone who has tried to get his friends into the franchise a few different ways, I had a lot of hopes for Shin going into it. A self-contained, solid film that exhibits the best traits of the series would have been a fantastic way to induce newcomers to it. Instead, Shin Kamen Rider is maybe the least accessible work in the series, relying on themes and motifs not just of early Kamen Rider, but of both the director's other work and some of Kamen Rider's more vintage brethren. I can't say I'm not a bit disappointed, but I also can't really say I dislike it either. As critical as I am of the film, and as flawed as I think it encapsulates something ethereal about the original that I find enchanting. Under it all, Shin Kamen Rider is a story about a severely traumatized man taking up extreme violence to protect a nebulous concept of peace from an amorphous entity that seeks control. Much like the original that aired 50 years ago, the plot may be simple and aimless, but the masked rider himself cuts through it all as a tragic and endearing hero. In that sense, it may honestly be the truest Kamen Rider we've ever gotten. In hindsight, my skepticism and surprise at Anno tackling the Rider series was completely unfounded. Part of why I love Kamen Rider is its focus on character and emotion, which defined my love of Evangelion originally. And the only reason I cared to give Evangelion a shot in the first place was a childhood obsession with the giant monsters of Godzilla. Art is a whirl of influence and affinity that's ever tightening inward, and my love affair with Kamen Rider did not actually begin when I started watching the show somewhat recently. It began when I first watched Evangelion in high school, and it was inevitable that I would love the series that influenced and spawned a work that has become so dear to me in the first place. That's it. That's the end of the review.